Hello, my name is Robert Paul Wolff, and this is the last in my series of 10 lectures on ideological critique. Over the weeks as I've been giving these lectures, I have invited my former students to join me in an imaginary classroom here, somewhat to overcome the anonymity and the loneliness of lecturing to a camcorder sitting on my desk. Jennifer Jensen Wallach and Andrew Rosa and Tanya Mears and Rita Reynolds, all of whom were students in the doctoral program in Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, where I taught for many years, have joined me here. So too have Tom Cathcart and Thomas Nagel, who were my students 55 years ago in the Harvard University Philosophy Department, and Derek Parfit, who was my student briefly in the Columbia Philosophy Department 10 years later, and also Becca Zizwe Ndemande, who was never actually my student but was a recipient of one of my bursaries in the scholarship program I ran in South Africa for poor black students going to historically black universities. They are all now gathered here for the last lecture, and I will just remind you all that your imaginary term papers are due a week from today, after which I will read them and give them imaginary grades. Derek, since this is only an imaginary paper, you are free to write another 110-page opus if you wish, understanding that I will give it the same attention that I gave your first 110-page paper all those years ago at Columbia. Let me review briefly for you what I've been doing in the first 9 lectures. In lectures 1, 2, and 3, I talked at length about the work of Karl Mannheim in his classic work, Ideology and Utopia. And it was that work that set the framework for everything that came afterward. In lectures 4, 5, 6, and 7, I focused on the brilliant ideological critique mounted by Edwin Wilmson of ethnographic work done by Richard Lee and his associates in the Kalahari Desert of southern Africa. In lectures 8 and 9, I turned my attention to the work of Henry Louis Gates, Jr. in his book, The Signifying Monkey, and his ideological critique of high literary criticism of the sort that he encountered at Yale University when he was a student and then a professor there. In this last lecture, which is in a way a kind of coda to those, I'm going to turn to the work of Edward Said. Said, as many of you I'm sure know, was a brilliant literary critic who spent virtually his entire career teaching at Columbia University. A Palestinian Christian, Said was a tireless advocate for the interests of the Palestinians and a devastating critique of the ideologically encoded perceptions of the non-European world by a number of scholars, including Bernard Lewis. Said was a lover of literature, as we shall see, as well as a critic of it. And in his 1993 book, Culture and Imperialism, he devoted a good deal of attention to the novels of Europe and Great Britain and their connection with the imperial adventures of France and Great Britain and the other European powers in Asia and Africa. Let me just read you Said's general thesis. He says, near the beginning of his book, the extraordinary formal and ideological dependence of the great French and English realistic novels on the facts of empire has never been studied from a general theoretical standpoint. And that is what he proposes to do. He goes on somewhat later to say, he says, I am not trying to say that the novel, or the culture in the broad sense, caused imperialism, but that the novel as a cultural artifact of bourgeois society and imperialism are unthinkable without each other. Of all the major literary forms, the novel is the most recent, its emergence the most datable, its occurrence the most Western, its normative pattern of social authority the most structured. Imperialism and the novel fortified each other to such a degree that it is impossible, I would argue, to read one without in some way dealing with the other. It won't come as any surprise to you when I tell you that Said, almost by himself, created the whole sub-discipline of post-colonial literature, to which he himself made such important contributions. Let me read you one more passage from farther on in his book. He says, "Studying the relationship between the West and its dominated cultural others is not just a way of understanding an unequal relationship between unequal interlocutors, but is also a point of entry into studying the formation and meaning of Western cultural practices themselves, and the persistent disparity in power between the West and non-West must be taken into account if we are accurately to understand cultural forms like that of the novel." That's Said's central claim, that the novel is both a product of and a supporter of European imperialism in the 19th and 20th centuries. Said's central claim as a literary critic is that we must subject each work to a cultural and ideological critique without in any way denying or diminishing its greatness as art. Let me emphasize that. It's important to understand that Said, throughout his entire life, was a lover of the novels that he studied. He cherished them, he valued them, he held them in high esteem as works of art. And his ideological critique of their connections with imperialism was in no way intended to diminish their value as works of art. It's very important to understand that. Said would, I think, be very unhappy were he to think that we took from his work the lesson that we can diminish or simply dispense with the great works of 19th and 20th century fiction in Europe because they are involved with imperialism. Let me just read you one more brief note to give you some sense of what how Said talks about this. He says, each text, that is, each of the novels that he's talking about, has its own particular genius, as does each geographical region of the world, with its own overlapping experiences and interdependent histories of conflict. As far as the cultural work is concerned, a distinction between particularity and sovereignty or hermetic exclusiveness can usefully be made. Obviously, no reading should try to generalize so much as to efface the identity of a particular text, author, or movement. By the same token, it should allow that what was or appeared to be certain for a given work or author may become subject to disputation. Kipling's India in Kim has a quality of permanence and inevitability that belongs not just to that wonderful novel, but to British India, its history, administration, and apologists, and no less important, to the India fought for by Indian nationalists as their country to be won back. Notice what he says about Kim. He says, that wonderful novel. Kim is the quintessentially imperialist novel. And yet, Said loves it, cherishes it, and wants us to love it as well. Excuse me. I've gone out of the camera for a moment to pick up a book that dropped. Now, not surprisingly, in his book, Said talks about Kipling, he talks about Joseph Conrad, he even has a good many references to Verdi's great opera Aida. But he also has a discussion of Jane Austen, and especially of her novel Mansfield Park. Mansfield Park? What on earth could Mansfield Park have to do with Said's thesis about British imperialism and the slave trade and such things? Of all the novelists in the great tradition of 19th and 20th century European novels, one would think that Jane Austen was the least involved with the imperial adventures of the British Crown. And yet, Said takes this novel, Mansfield Park, and seriously claims that the underpinnings, the foundation of the novel, is British imperialism, and more specifically, the British slave trade and the British slave plantations in the West Indies. That's the subject of today's lecture, Mansfield Park, Said's critique of it, and our attempt to decide whether Said is correct in analyzing Mansfield Park in this way. So let me begin with a brief summary of Mansfield Park. All of you, I hope, have heard of Jane Austen. All of you have read at least one novel by Jane Austen, but probably if you've only read one novel, it's Pride and Prejudice. Mansfield Park, which is the third of the novels that she published, but the fourth to be written as it happens, is one of the less well-known of Austen's novels. Now, there are Austen lovers who reread all of Austen's novels every year, a fact that I discovered when I gave a lecture on this subject some years ago in Washington, D.C. These lovers of Austen call themselves Janeites, and they literally reread the entire corpus every year. But I trust that most of you have not read all the novels every year and may never even have read Mansfield Park. So here is a brief summary. I'm going to do something that is unnecessary, but that I can't resist doing. I'm going to read to you the opening paragraph of the novel. Now, I don't need to do that in order to summarize it, but Austen is so delicious that I can't resist. Here is the absolutely opening of the novel. It's not the entire paragraph. That runs on for more than a page. It's just the first 6 or 7 lines. It starts like this. About 30 years ago, Miss Maria Ward of Huntington, with only £7,000, had the good luck to captivate Sir Thomas Bertram of Mansfield Park in the county of Northampton, and to be thereby raised to the rank of a baronet's lady, with all the comforts and consequences of a handsome home and large income. All Huntingdon exclaimed on the greatness of the match, and her uncle, the lawyer himself, allowed her to be at least £3,000 short of any equitable claim to it. That's Jane Austen at her absolute best. At any rate, there are 3 sisters. The oldest sister marries Sir Thomas Bertram, the master of this estate called Mansfield Park, and they have 4 children, Tom, Edmund, Maria, and Julia. The second sister marries a clergyman who is installed in the Mansfield Park parsonage. That is to say, that's within the control of Sir Thomas. So he looks after his wife's sister by putting her husband in the parsonage. This is what was called giving him a living. That is to say, a parsonage that he was the parson of. The third marries badly, I'm afraid, a lieutenant of marine named Price, and in rapid succession has 9 children. The entire ménage lives in the naval port city of Portsmouth. As the story opens, the second oldest of the 9 children of this sister who married badly, whose name is Fanny, who's now 10 years old, is sent to live with her wealthy uncle, aunt, and cousins at Mansfield Park. This as a way of relieving her parents of a small measure of the cost of their large family. Fanny Price is the heroine of Mansfield Park. The story, some 400 pages in my edition, is a simple domestic tale about the succession of events that leads, at long last, after 400 pages or so, and to the great relief of the reader, to Fanny marrying the second son, Edmund. Any of you who are lovers of Jane Austen will have spotted Edmund and Fanny as likely partners in the first 30 or 40 pages. But it takes 400 pages before they finally discover that they are in love with one another. Austen introduces 2 plot devices to stir things up and guarantee some narrative movement. The first is that Sir Thomas, the master of Mansfield Hall, goes off for 2 years to look after his investments elsewhere, taking his oldest son Tom with him. He goes off to the West Indies, where he owns some plantations. And those plantations, we are given to understand, are the source of the wealth that enables him to maintain Mansfield Park. and which makes him such a good catch for Maria Ward. Leaving Mansfield Park, Sir Thomas leaves the young people, now in their 20s and late teens, to get into assorted mischief. And that assorted mischief takes up much of the novel. During his absence, as Fanny is turning 18, a young, wealthy, attractive, socially well-placed, but morally questionable brother and sister, Mary and Henry Crawford, show up in the neighborhood and wreak all manner of havoc in the quiet, staid Bertram household. And that's pretty much the novel. 350 pages after the Crawfords arrive, Maria and Julia have been ruined, Tom has nearly died of brain fever, Edmund finally realizes that he loves Fanny, they get married, and the novel ends happily. It's a wonderful novel with, as you could imagine, the most precise, acute, and exquisitely phrased observations by Jane Austen on the moral and social complexities of this world of the gentry in the countryside of England in the first decades of the 19th century. How on earth can Ed Said possibly extract an historical, ideological, literary, political lesson from this unpromising text? Well, the clue is that Sir Thomas' interests that take him away from Mansfield Park for 2 years are in Antigua, a British colony in the West Indies. In short, Sir Thomas is the proprietor of a sugar plantation worked by slaves. Here is what Said has to say. Austen's awareness of empire is obviously very different, alluded to very much more casually than Conrad's or Kipling's. In her time, the British were extremely active in the Caribbean and in South America, notably Brazil and Argentina. Austen seems only vaguely aware of the details of these activities. We'll discover that's not quite true. Although she senses the sense that extensive West Indian plantations were important was fairly widespread in metropolitan England. Antigua and Sir Thomas's trip there have a definitive function in Mansfield Park, which I have been saying is both incidental, referred to only in passing, and absolutely crucial to the action. How are we to assess Austen's few references to Antigua, and what are we to make of them interpretatively? And now Said says, my contention is that by that very odd combination of casualness and stress, Austen reveals herself to be assuming, just as Fanny assumes in both senses of the word, the importance of an empire to the situation at home. Let me go further, Said says. Since Austen refers to and uses Antigua as she does in Mansfield Park, there needs to be a commensurate effort on the part of her readers to understand concretely the historical valences in the reference. To put it differently, we should try to understand what she referred to, why she gave it the importance she did, and why indeed she made the choice, for she might have done something different to establish Sir Thomas's wealth. You can see how he is reading between the lines or beneath the surface of the text in order to connect up Mansfield Park with plantation slavery in the British Empire. Let me break into my narration at this point to take a trip to the movies, if I may. In 1999, shortly after I had read Culture and Imperialism, my wife Susie and I went to the movies in Amherst, Massachusetts to see a film of Mansfield Park made by Patricia Rozema, a Canadian director. It's a wonderful film, by the way, and if you haven't seen it, I strongly urge you to find it somewhere, Netflix, Amazon, maybe on the cable channels. Take a look at it. It's a beautifully done film, and it has the Nobel Prize winning playwright Harold Pinter playing Sir Thomas, believe it or not. In that movie, as I watched it, I began to realize that Rozema had been powerfully influenced by Said's essay and had made the movie, in a sense, to make explicit what Said says is implicit in the novel. Let me give you one example, which is the most striking of all the examples. There are 3 or 4 in the movie, but this one is really powerful. At one point, as I mentioned, Tom gets something they call brain fever. And Fanny, among others, has to look after him while he is in bed sick for a long period of time. Looking after him didn't mean doing anything for them. In the early part of the 19th century, medical science was completely incapable of curing anybody of anything. But what you did was to sit by the bedside, just to be there, and if he woke up and needed something, to be able to help him. In the middle of the night, one night in the movie, Fanny is sitting by the bedside, just sitting there being with Tom, who is asleep. And she sees a sketchbook on the night table next to the bed. She picks it up idly and starts leafing through it, and discovers to her horror that it contains a series of vivid charcoal sketches made by Tom of his father, Sir Thomas, torturing his slaves in the Antigua plantation. As she sits there horrified as these images, which are shown to you in the film, Sir Thomas comes in to look after his son, sees Fanny looking at this sketchbook, seizes it out of her hand, tears it up, throws it in the fire, and sends Fanny away. Now, nothing remotely like this happens in the novel. This is all made up by Patricia Rozema. She is in effect saying, Edward Said says that the novel is really about slavery. I'm going to show that it's about slavery so that everybody watching the movie can see that directly. And there are some other things that I'll mention later on which capture this as well. One quite striking, when Susie and I saw the movie, we stayed to the end of the credits. Now, those of you who've been to the movies, and I know you've all been to the movies, are aware that after the first credits roll with the stars and maybe the director and the producers, then there's an endless series of credits of the hundreds of people who participate in the making of a novel, of a movie. And it's always fascinating to me how many hundreds of people it takes to make a movie. The key grips and the best boys and the makeup artists and the doubles and the driver for the star and the driver for the second star and so forth and so on. Well, Susie and I sat and watched all of the credits. In the first part of the credits, there was very nice early 19th century English music playing in the background. But then, about halfway through the credits, along about the time when most of the people in the theater had left, the music changed. And for the remainder of the credits, what one heard was doleful African chants by the slaves on the plantations. It was Patricia Rozema's way of saying, this is a movie made from a novel that is about not only English country life, but also slave plantations in the New World. It was very powerful, very subtle, very effective. Well, is there any mention of slavery or Antigua actually in the text of Mansfield Park? I went through the book and very carefully noted each one of the places where anything remotely like such a reference can be found. There are, in fact, 11 brief mentions of Antigua in the entire novel, and only one direct use of the word slave. I'll read it to you. I think we ought to hear it, since it is literally the only place in the entire novel where the word slave appears. Here it is. Edmund and Fanny are talking, and Edmund is encouraging Fanny to believe that she has grown into an attractive young woman. Fanny finds that very hard to believe. And he is also encouraging her to play a somewhat more active role in the evening conversations, which were a regular part of the Bertram household after dinner was over. Fanny says, "Oh, don't talk so," cried Fanny, distressed by more feelings than he was aware of. But seeing that she was distressed, he had done with the subject and only added more seriously that what Fanny is protesting is that he's saying that she has a lovely complexion and a lovely figure. We know, because we are faithful readers of Jane Austen, that Fanny is in love with Edmund, even though she doesn't yet know it. And she is flustered by the fact that he is paying attention to her as a woman. It's about as close as you get to sex in a Jane Austen novel, so you got to enjoy it when you see it. At any rate, he says, "Your uncle is disposed to be pleased with you in every respect, and I only wish you would talk to him more. You are one of those who are too silent in the evening circle." And she replies, "But I do talk to him more than I used. I am sure I do. Did you not hear me ask him about the slave trade last night?" That's it. That's, in this whole novel, that's the only reference to the slave trade. It's the one use of the word slave in the entire novel. Incidentally, you may be interested to know, there is one other mention of slavery in all of Austen's novels, in a passage in Emma, which is not about slavery, by the way. How can Said extract a high-powered political and cultural reading from these few bits and snatches of text? Well, a little background is called for here. We need to recall some things about Britain's involvement in the slave trade and West Indian slavery. We need to take a look at the role of slavery in Britain's economy in the early 19th century, at the time when Mansfield Park was written and is set, and we need to learn something about Jane Austen's own knowledge of, or connection with, and attitude toward West Indian slavery. And it turns out we can actually find something out about that. The slave trade first. The West Indies were, of course, colonized by the imperial powers for profit. And the establishment of sugar plantations in the British West Indies supported not only the rage of tea drinking, but also produced molasses to make rum, indigo for dyeing clothes, and from North America, valuable hardwoods for furniture. There was something called the triangular trade. I don't know how many of you have heard of the triangular trade, but it was the central international trade fact of the 19th century. Let me read you a description of it from a very important book by Eric Williams called Capitalism and Slavery. Williams was a Jamaican scholar. This was actually his doctoral dissertation, believe it or not. And in Capitalism and Slavery, he describes the triangular trade in the following way. In this triangular trade, England, France, and colonial America equally supplied the exports and the ships, Africa the human merchandise, the plantations the colonial raw materials. The slave ships sailed from the home country, say from England, with a cargo of manufactured goods. These were exchanged at a profit on the coast of Africa for Negroes, who were traded on the plantations at another profit in exchange for a cargo of colonial produce to be taken back to the home country. So that was the triangular trade, from England to the coast of West Africa, to the plantations of the Caribbean or of North America, and then back to England again. And that triangular trade was an extremely important part of the economy of the 19th century. Indeed, Williams argues that it was that triangular trade that produced the capital that underwrote the transformation of the British economy into a capitalist economy in the 19th century. Just to give you one striking fact, in the 18th century, between 1714 and 1773, imports into Britain from this tiny island of Antigua were 3 times as large in value as all of the imports from New England. Think of that. This tiny island of Antigua sent imports that were in value 3 times as valuable as all of the imports from New England at the same time. It tells you something about how important this Caribbean trade was. But, and this is the important fact that underlies the novel, in the beginning of the 19th century, sugar production in the West Indies peaked and started to decline, and profits dropped for everybody. The result was that Sir Thomas's plantations were not producing as much in the way of profit as they had been, and that was his concern for his so-called West Indian interests. That's why Sir Thomas goes to the Caribbean, because he's not making as much money from his plantations as he had been. And that's the real source of his wealth, not the big house and the land, which was very nice, but was not a source of wealth in the way that the Antiguan plantations were. Now we can ask, what did Jane Austen know about all of this? Well, it turns out rather more than you might imagine. First of all, there was a very prominent Antiguan slave owner and sugar magnate named James Langford Nibbs, who was a close family friend of the Austens. Austen's father had taught Nibbs at Oxford. Nibbs was the godfather of Austen's oldest brother, and Austen's father was a principal trustee of Nibbs's Antiguan estates when Nibbs died. In other words, at the dinner table, so to speak, when they were just having their conversation, Jane Austen would have learned from her father a very great deal in detail about the Antiguan slave plantations and their role in underwriting the wealth of the British as landed gentry. The second point is that Parliament banned the slave trade, but not slavery, just the slave trade, in 1807. And British naval vessels started stopping English ships that were carrying slaves. Austen's favorite brother, Francis, served on a British ship charged with intercepting slavers. And in one long extant letter, Francis writes to his sister Jane about what he had seen of slavery, the horrors that he had seen when they stopped these slave ships, which were packed with slaves in the hold of the ship, like stacked like so many cords of wood. Austen herself wrote letters showing her to be sympathetic to the abolition of slavery, which was being much agitated for during the years that she wrote Mansfield Park. With all of this evidence, I think we can fairly conclude with Said that the subject of West Indian slavery, and thus of British imperialism, is in some sense present in Mansfield Park. But there is one more piece of evidence, and it is decisive. It turns out that Said is correct, and that Jane Austen knew exactly what she was doing when she wrote Mansfield Park. She wrote Mansfield Park about slavery, believe it or not. And even though the word only appears once in the novel, that is really what the novel is about. What is this last piece of evidence? This is, I must say, to me, one of the most striking pieces of evidence of this sort I've ever come across. And it is therefore the piece of evidence with which I complete and bring to an end this series of lectures. This is the case of James Somerset. Briefly, there was a British plantation owner named Charles Stuart in the 18th century who bought a slave named James Somerset in Virginia. In 1769, Stuart brought James Somerset to England as his manservant. And 2 years later, Stuart decided that he would take Stuart back to Virginia and sell him. Slaves, by the way, were extremely valuable property, and he would have gotten a great deal of money for this slave, James Stuart. Well, Somerset managed to escape from Stuart's household, and through the intervention of 3 British citizens who were abolitionists, who were opposed to slavery, managed to bring a case into an English court in which he argued that because he was in England, he was a free man, and therefore his so-called owner, Charles Stuart, could not take him back to Virginia and sell him there as a slave. The case was heard by William Murray, who was the Lord Chief Justice of England. It was a very important case, a landmark case. And in that case, William Murray, the Lord Chief Justice, found for James Somerset and freed him. The heart of his decision is contained in these words, which go down in history as some of the most important words ever written by a Lord Chief Justice in England. He wrote, "The state of slavery is of such a nature that it is incapable of being introduced on any reasons, moral or political, but only by positive law, which preserves its force long after the reasons, occasion, and time itself from whence it was created is erased from memory." The point here, it is so odious, the Lord Chief Justice says about slavery, that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law. Let me just explain what all of this means. England, of course, English law was the English common law. It was not based on a series of statutes. It was simply based on immemorial decisions and the precedent created by those decisions. Murray is saying that there is nothing in the traditions of the common law that justifies slavery. The only thing that could possibly justify slavery in England would be an actual positive law, that is, a law passed by the legislature, by the British Parliament, establishing slavery in England. And there was no such law. Since there was no such law, and since nothing in the common law could possibly justify the status of slavery, there was no slavery in England. He says, to conclude his decision, whatever inconveniences therefore may follow from the decision, I cannot say that this case is allowed or approved of by the law of England, and therefore the black must be discharged. In other words, he found against Charles Murray, who had gone into court, who had argued in court that this was his property and it ought to be returned to him. And the Lord Chief Justice said, no, slavery is so odious that it has no place in British common law, and since there is no British positive law passed by a British Parliament that establishes slavery as a status in England, this man, James Somerset, is free. That case was the landmark case, leading finally to the complete abolition of slavery, the slave trade, and all traces of slavery in the British Empire. And Jane Austen would certainly have known about that case. And now the Boffo conclusion of these lectures. Why do I believe that when Jane Austen wrote Mansfield Park, she was writing about slavery? Well, who was William Murray? He was, to be sure, the Lord Chief Justice of England, but he also had a title. He was the first Earl of Mansfield. Need I say more? Thank you for watching.